Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Ultramarine Kill Team from the Warhammer 40k Kill Team starter set. So to save a lot of time, the very first thing I've done is sprayed them with some Macragge blue spray from Games Workshop. Then I'm going to use some Abaddon black to paint the undersuit and the weapons casings. Then I'm going to use Iron Hand steel to pick out all of the silver details. And don't forget to check the bases for any silver details that might be on there as well. Next, I'm going to use Dryad bark to paint the pouches. And I'm going to use the fang to paint the cloak of the sniper. Then I'm going to wash all those pieces with some Nuln oil. I'm also going to use Nuln oil to paint into the gaps of the armour to try and give those a little bit more shading. Once those washes have dried, we're going to do a 50-50 mix of Macragge blue and Calgar blue to start highlighting the armour. This is mostly going to be an edge highlight, but not quite an edge highlight. It's going to go in a little bit further than you normally would with an edge highlight, but not too far. Then we're going to use Calgar blue just by itself for the edge highlight. Now when doing this, make sure you keep your paintbrush nice and flat and run it along the edge as carefully as you can. Next, we're going to start working on those pouches, and we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Dryad bark and Gothor brown for the first highlight. And the second will be Gothor brown just by itself. Then I'll use Corvus black to highlight any of the black casings on the weapons and any other areas that I've painted black. And while I've got the Corvus black out, I'm going to use it to paint the inside of the cloak of the Eliminator, which I'll then wash with some Nuln oil. Once that wash has dried, we're going to highlight the inside of the cloak with some Eshin Grey, and we're also going to use the Eshin Grey to highlight all the weapon casings. I'm then going to relayer the fang and making sure I avoid any of the recesses. This is followed by a 70-30 mix of the fang and wraithbone. And then the same mix but at a 50-50 ratio for the second highlight. I'm now going to use Retributor armour to paint any of the gold. I'm going to use Catachan flesh to paint any dark skin. And Bugman's glow to paint any light. Both the gold and the skin will then receive a wash with some Reikland flesh shade. While that wash dries, I'm going to use some Screamer pink to paint the wax seal of the purity seals. And for the paper parts, I'm going to use some Rakarth flesh. The purity seals will then receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. Next, we're going to relayer the gold with some Retributor armour. And this will be followed by a highlight of Uruk armour gold. Then on the very sharp corners, we're going to use some Stormhost silver. We'll also use this to highlight the silver. Then before we start the skin, I'm going to use some Abaddon black to mark the eyes. Followed by matte white. And then Abaddon black once again for the pupils. Moving on to the dark skin, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Catachan flesh and Blood Reaver flesh for the first highlight. Followed by Blood Reaver flesh just by itself for the second. And then a 50-50 mix of Blood Reaver flesh and Night Quester flesh for the last. For the light skin, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. This will be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh for the highlight. And then finally a little bit of Kislev flesh just on the tips of the nose, the eyebrows and the cheeks. Then moving back to the Purity Seals wax, we're going to relayer the Screamer pink, avoiding the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Screamer pink and Pink Horror for the highlight. We also completely forgot to do the teeth on any models that are showing the teeth, so for that just use some matte white. And then relayer the paper on the Purity Seals with some Rakarth flesh. And to highlight, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Rakarth flesh. Then we're going to use the Wraithbone to paint the inside of the cloak and the loincloth of the captain. I'm going to paint any black hair with a Baden black. And any blonde, we're going to use some Xandri dust. Both the Xandri dust and the Wraithbone will then be washed with some Army Painter soft tone. Then the black hair will be washed with some Nuln oil. Once the wash is dried, I'm going to relayer the Wraithbone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and matte white, followed by a little bit of matte white just by itself. To highlight the blonde hair, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Xandri dust and Screaming Skull. And to highlight the black, I'm going to use some Corvus black. Then I'm going to paint the back of the cloak with Mephiston red. This is along with the rope around the captain's torso. And any lights that I choose to be red. Then the cloak and the rope will receive a wash with some Carroburg Crimson. To paint the smoke from the smoke grenade, I'm going to use Grey Seer, followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Seer and matte white. And then lastly, matte white just by itself on the very peaks and tips. Going back to the cloak, I'm going to relayer the Mephiston red just to tidy things up a little bit. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mephiston red and Evil Sun Scarlet for the first highlight. Then we're going to use Evil Sun Scarlet just by itself, but first of all we're also going to use it to dot any lights. And then we'll continue to highlight the cloak. Then we're going to do a very, very light dry brush of Evil Sun Scarlet onto the rope. And then going back to the cloak, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red for the next highlight. And then we're going to use Wild Rider Red for another dot on the lights, as well as the final highlight for the cloak and the rope. Lastly, for the lights and the lenses, we're going to use a tiny dot of matte white just to give them a little bit of a shine. Moving on to the bases, we're going to paint the muddy areas with Dryad Bark, and any rocks are going to be painted with Dawnstone. Then both these areas will be dry brushed with some Carrick Stone. Then I'm going to pick any shell casings out with some Retributor armor. For the skull, we're going to use some Morghast bone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast bone and Wraithbone. And then finally Wraithbone just by itself for the final highlight. Next, I'm going to paint the rims of the bases with a Baden black. And then finally, washing the bases with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. And then all that's left to do is to add some transfers. One thing I do advise to help flatten the transfers on Space Marine shoulder pads is definitely get some decal softener. You might need a couple of coats, but make sure it's completely dry before you add in a second coat. Once those transfers have dried, that's these guys complete. I have to say, it's a lot of fun painting these guys. I'm not a big fan of batch painting, but these models are unique enough for me to enjoy the experience. I hope you'll have as much fun as I did painting them. They definitely are worth taking that time and effort as well, because they look fantastic on the battlefield. The only downside being is they did take a long time to paint. They rocked in around about 13 hours to paint all 7. If you followed this guide, I really do hope it helped, and I hope you consider subscribing as well. I've got plenty more videos on the channel, ranging from all different things, from Marvel Crisis Protocol to Masters of the Universe Battleground, Star Wars Shatterpoint, 40k, and I hope to get some Blood Bowl stuff and some more 40k stuff up on the channel soon. So, again, thank you so much for watching, and I guess all that's left to say is goodbye for now, so goodbye for now.